Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Raise your hand if you cannot hear me. Okay, nobody raised his hand or her. My name is Mueller. I work for the Eclipse Foundation since 2005 now. I'm just a few words on me. This is sort of where I'm coming from. I'm a computer scientist since many years. I've started my work in environments like this, where we were building software and software products for companies like IBM, Siemens, and others. We typically were building full stack applications. What does that mean? We were hidden in a castle. We had no access to outside information, and we just went and built products. So we couldn't see how our products would arrive at the market, what the market actually appreciated. We had only limited insight in that, and we were working away for a couple of years, and sometimes our things actually made it to market, and sometimes we experienced that, oh, the market doesn't need it. So we basically wasted 5-7 years of resources and money into building something that nobody really wanted. We are talking about open source today, so it may be interesting for you to get some insight on where it all comes from. In about 83 of the last millennium, a guy by the name of Richard Stallman launched something called the GNU project. What was his motivation? His motivation was that he was not able to solve his problems in ways that were normal to the software industry at the time. So to build products and then have these products launched into the market, he was trying to look for some new ways of collaboration that was about collaboratively building things, sharing this information, sharing not only the information about what he was building, but sharing the actual code. So he was one of these people who was thinking that the software industry or the software production needs a completely different paradigm, and that's why he created something called the GNU public license, which has basically 4 cornerstones that made it completely different from the software products that you typically had. Typically, you bought software like WinWord or Microsoft Excel or other things, and you could use the software, and there was a very limited area of endeavor that you could use it. You couldn't change it, you couldn't add to it, and in some cases there might be an API where you could extend it, but you could have no insight. So if a problem happened with the software, you were just doomed. You had to wait for the company who offered this product to get it fixed. And it became very tedious and very time-consuming to get through these processes, to get through these cycles of innovation. So innovation was very limited, and one of the best examples of limitation of such platforms is Microsoft Windows, which took forever and forever and forever to bring some innovation to the market. So his idea was to give software away, to have everybody use it and give them 4 rights, which were to use it, so the normal stuff, but the use was not bound to any monetarian exchange. So he said everything should be for free. You were also allowed to investigate. Investigate means you could look at the actual code. So if you received something under one of these open source licenses, in the beginning there was just GPL, you could actually look at the code, you could investigate it, you could learn from it, you could see what was broken, and with the 3rd right to modify this code, you actually have the chance to modify it, to extend it, and then build your own distribution or your own extensions to it and give it away to people. So this distribution right, the number 4, this sort of comprises the 4 basic rights that a receiver of an open source product, I want to say, could do. He could use, he could investigate, he could modify, and he could redistribute. That was the idea of Richard Stallman, and as you may have seen from the original GNU project, it was very successful. One of the most famous open source projects that is distributed under the GPL is obviously Linux, that some of you might even use, that you can look into, that you can extend, that you can patch, and organizations like Google or Facebook and so on would not be able to run their stacks today if there was no Linux under the GNU public license. This was, however, limiting especially the business models on how you could build a commercial company around Linux to a couple of use cases. One of the use cases best known is obviously to create Linux distributions. So companies like Red Hat, SUSE in Germany in the past, and many others were bidding on this type of a use case. Later on in '97, other folks like Raymond or the Mozilla guys, the original Netscape, they were investigating a different model where they said software isn't free as in liberal or in an almost socialist approach, but hey, man, it should be free as in beer, so there should be no limitations in terms of the redistribution, where you had to redistribute your code under the same license, which was GPL, but they invented the Apache license. And in case you haven't done this, Raymond has actually written a very good book about it, which is called Cathedral and Bazaar, still a bestseller after many years, and a thing you should really investigate if you want to get more familiar with open source. So the idea here was really you create some open source project, you distribute the code under the Apache license, which is called a liberal license, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can bundle it into a commercial offering, you can change it, you can use it for whatever endeavor you want. So here, an idea of creating other business models. The Mozilla browser is certainly one of the very good examples, but also the Apache web server, which by today, I think, runs 80 or 90% of all the web offerings that you know in the world, was one of the most successful endeavors in this space. Why do all this? I mentioned before, we were working in projects and we always had no insight of what happened in the outside world, and the outside world didn't see what we are doing until some product came to market. So if you look at this diagram here, actually taken from a book called Open Innovation by Henry Chesbrough. He worked at Berkeley and he did research of closed and open organizations. A closed organization was typically characterized by this castle that I mentioned earlier. They almost failed in the 90s, so many of them had close to death experiences, IBM being one of them. So they were looking at new paradigms, and Chesbrough actually suggested the so-called open innovation game, which is while you develop a product or a software or whatever, you start actually actively trying to get feedback from outside communities to see how your things are. And also, on the other hand, you didn't plan for 5 years in some waterfall type of method, but you went out and said, hey, rather than playing chess, I need to play poker. So with every card you turn, you want to follow what the feedback you got from the outside communities and change your product or your product setup very quickly. What that means is you need to have components, you need to have platforms that you can in-source and that allow you to change the building blocks and the setup of your product, add new components, add new functions. And it turns out that open source was a very, very good paradigm to support this type of an approach. Again, if you talk about open source, you should really be familiar with these types of rules that for most of the open source licenses apply. We had the four first one. One other thing is, I worked in the automotive industry for a while, and there was, of course, a lot of activities in standardizing things. One of the most famous one in this space is a standard called AUTOSAR that the automotive community used to build a platform for in-vehicle components, so for computers that were used in vehicles, to sort of build a framework on top of the different automotive buses and allow organizations to split the applications from the underlying middleware. So a platform that was used, or is nowadays used very heavily in cars to build new functions and to make them independent of the underlying network layers. However, they made a big mistake, at least I understand it was a big mistake when they were setting it up, because they were discriminating against field of endeavor. They said, this is software that must just run in automotive environments. So it couldn't, while it was a very good approach, it couldn't run, for example, in production machines, or it couldn't run in airplanes. So all of these different domains had to investigate and had to basically invent their own AUTOSAR for their domains, because they were not allowed to use it, which created a lot of muda, a lot of garbage, a lot of double work, and so on. Open source explicitly allows or mentions that you cannot discriminate against persons and groups. So if you build an open source project, it might be used by the NSA as well as by North Korea. And it might be used in automotive, it might be used in aerospace, it might be used in web development and anywhere else. So work that has been created once could now be used all over the place. And this opened a lot more business models. For example, a company that had just built something for the medical domain was now allowed to use it in another domain and to also sell its products or sell its solutions on top of the open source stack that were originally meant to be for medical into some other domains. This was a big help and created all sorts of new and interesting business opportunities. So why do people actually deal with open source? We had some investigations done by a university in Canada, originally tasked by a company called Nortel, and they came to a surprising result. If you believe that today nobody denies anymore that he or she should, or the company should somehow be involved in open source, we could identify reasons and steps why companies are getting involved in open source. Most of the time, companies start to use open source, and that's the reason for that is fairly simple. Rather than developing the whole stack by yourself and maintaining the stack by yourself, you use components from an open source stack. Why do you do that? Because you actually save money in your development. You save money and time to market. You can bring your tool or your solution a lot faster to the market by just not doing all the work yourself, but to have your expensive resources and your very capable resources work on the actual customer solution, and not on building yet another TCP/IP stack or just another widget set. And this continues. Engineer-driven has no limits, if you want so. The more you use, the more you contribute, or the more you champion solutions in that space, the more money you save, or the faster you actually get your product and your solutions to your customer. And then there's the other side, the right side of the diagram, where people use, or companies use open source to reach strategic goals. One of the best examples that everybody knows is probably Google's solutions to cell phones, Android. So they are providing an open source stack that companies can use. They get dragged into. Hardware developers use it. So LG and many other companies nowadays have their cell phones, their smartphones built on top of Android. It saves them a lot of time and it opens a completely new market to them. And it's standardized because on top of it, they can host the applications that were built for the Android space. So such an approach is called a strategic business model, where senior management, typically at the CEO's office, make these types of decisions and help to really reshape certain industries. An example from our life, so I work for the Eclipse Foundation. I want to introduce you to Mr. John Swainson. He was in 1996 and up to 2004 a vice president for the software group of IBM. And he had an issue. He was actually facing a situation where Microsoft was challenging IBM. Again, they had already challenged them in the operating system market for desktops and had pretty much gained 90 or more % of the desktop operating system market away from IBM, one must say. In case you remember, there was an operating system called OS/2 that was heavily competing with Microsoft's Windows X.X. Microsoft won clearly because they were providing a better platform, not technically, but how it can be consumed and how it can be extended. Microsoft was building an ecosystem on top of their Windows operating system that people could buy in. There was heavy barriers of getting in there, but it became the most used, and still today is the most used desktop platform. So Swainson was facing the situation that Microsoft was also challenging the IBM server market. So Microsoft was bringing up more and more products for servers. So IBM really was in a situation that they had to defend their biggest income stream, basically, or their most profitable income stream. And Swainson said, okay, Microsoft is coming up with this .NET strategy for the backend area. We must do something. At the time, Microsoft had a whole slew of backend frameworks and infrastructures and application frameworks. So he decided, together with other companies actually, like Oracle and a couple more, Sun was also very prominent in that, to bet the future of their companies more or less onto a platform called Java. At that time, Java was just a system for embedded development. That's what it was originally planned for. And this consortium, this industry consortium, if you want so, of the software industry, was pushing Java beyond the limits and made it one of the most prominent development or runtime platforms that was mostly in the backend servers and also became more and more prominent on the desktops. Now what Swainson needed to be successful was he needed to attract many developers, many companies, many organizations to use Java. And the strategy he decided on is that if you have very good development tools, companies will actually, or people will actually use them. If these development tools are for free, so open source, you create a real gold rush. And that's what happened. Swainson started to open source an internal IBM development, which is nowadays called Eclipse, and has become the most prominent tool over the years for Java development on the server side and elsewhere. So this was in 2001 the creation of the Java of the Eclipse project, which was comprised of an IDE for Java development and also of a tool that allowed you to actively extend this platform, this tools platform, for all sorts of other uses. And this was licensed not under the GPL, but it was licensed under a newly created open source license called the Eclipse public license, which allowed companies or organizations to use the code underneath and to open source and to build it into, integrate it into their products, which could be sold for money. So that was a fairly new idea. It was called a very business-friendly open source license. You take whatever you get from Eclipse, let's say, you bundle it together with your additions to Eclipse or to the Eclipse platform, and you sell it as products. So with 2001, we could see in the following years that a completely new ecosystem and a completely new market of about 2 or 3 billion. So the evaluation changes depending on whomever you ask. But a marketplace with a value of a couple of billion US dollars every year has been created by this open source effort. And Swainson became very successful with IBM. He could really protect and even grow his backend server market at IBM. So he sort of rescued, some people say that he sort of rescued IBM with this very bold move, open sourcing all this stuff. The interesting idea is that it's not, what he didn't do was he didn't just open source a tool. He actually created a platform that was creating an ecosystem on top of it that was allowing everybody who wanted to build his or her own business on top of this platform. The interesting thing was, while this whole effort was towards just creating something for Java, it created all sorts of things. So tools for pretty much every language that you can imagine, even including COBOL, Fortran, and Scala, and Perl, and Python, and whatnot are now available on this platform. One might argue that, okay, the platform has a couple of problems, and yes, they are right. The platform is getting old and it needs to be renovated. But also, other people had the idea of just taking the development parts of it away and create something that was called Rich Client Platform, that is nowadays used by organizations like the German ESA, the European ESA and ESOC, by the Swiss Railway, by the NASA, and God knows whom else. We just don't know who all the people are using this platform to run their business applications in-house. So something really magic has happened, which has made the Eclipse platform the platform du jour for many, many application developers. What they needed, on the other hand, was some sort of an organization that took care of it, because Swainson had the problem that his competitors didn't really want to participate in this effort, as long as IBM had the only say on where this platform was heading to. So they created the Eclipse Foundation, an independent organization outside of IBM that was taking care of the ruling and the governance and a couple of services that were available to this ecosystem. Now, this all costs money. There is no free lunch in the world, as you can see from this little cartoon that I actually very much like. So we needed these foundations as another help to give possibilities not just to the large organizations that could easily afford to go through such an effort, but one of the ideas was to provide a level playing field where small and medium-sized companies or individuals or researchers would get the same type of access and the same type of opportunities to all these things. As we went on, this is just an overview of all the companies that are now under the Eclipse banner. I leave it to you to study it later on, because I just get the sign that we are running a little out of time. The last thing I wanted to mention was that after the so-called producers of the open source software, and we have just recently in the last couple of years seen that also user companies have noticed that open source platforms provide a good business opportunity for them. So they typically, like this company here, Airbus, they have problems that they use a lot of software on one hand, but they may be dependent on the off-the-shelf software to an extent where products that they really need, like test tools for their airplanes, might be at end of life, so they are left with nothing to do. They have stagnation in the innovation space, and that turns out to be pretty expensive. So what they are looking for is longevity of these products, continuous innovation of the products, and cost reduction. So they are starting to basically build their own platforms, and they are even asking, and this is going across the industry. This could be automotive, this could be public transport, this could be aerospace, it could be medical, and you name it. I'll give you a couple of examples here, but they all notice that they can pretty much go and say, yes, we need this type of a platform. We task others to build the platform for us, and typically that's companies that already work in this space, or other SMEs that are very much focused on tailoring open source solutions, or even building open source solutions. And they all work on these platforms, and they all give money to SMEs and to engineering organizations or to research to help them to build and sustain platforms that they need. The only question here is that they ask, you have to build this as an open source platform for us, and you have to continue maintaining this open source platform. So money is flowing from large user organizations towards smaller ones. So we see, if you want so, a new type of open source community that has a completely different approach, that is user-driven, where users specify what they need, and invite research, invite small and medium organizations, and this way have the creation, or have these suppliers create the exact things that they need and to maintain over time. With this, I hand over to Steffen from Bosch, who gives you an example on how a large organization like Bosch looks at that and is actually trying to solve their industry problems together with research, SMEs, and helping to build an own platform. Thank you.
Okay, and actually, yeah, can I just, okay. Actually, we'll also, we are in a little bit of hurry because I've got a lot of slides, and we will need to go through that really quick. So don't yeah, be irritated when actually like the slides are changing a lot. Okay, anyway, so I just start because we don't have that much time. So what is actually the role of software in the industry at the moment? So that's a big question. We don't have a lot of time to look at it, but I want to just give you a short impression. So I've just taken 2 slides from Mike Milenkovic from his keynote from the last Eclipse Con in Ludwigsburg, and that illustrates it really well. Like, for example, in the automotive area, it's said that 90% of the automotive innovation is actually realized by software. But this is like, you can also see a lot of the executives of various companies saying that actually in the future, every industrial company, one way or the other, has to become a software company. So it's more or less, software is really becoming the key role in the industry as well, not only in the IT industry. So why actually open source? Open source is has a lot of reasons why it's good for like industry, but also for the IT industry in general. So one of the reasons why you should and why many people use open source software is because software has become that cheap. So it's not really that much. It makes not that much sense any longer to actually produce it by yourself. And the most easiest accessible way to use it is by open source. So when you're looking at this thing, you see that from the 1980s to today, actually the software prices have fallen down to 0.7% to its prices that it was in 1980. The other thing is that actually more and more the software is no longer the important part. It's the functionality and what is coming with it and the services around it, websites, apps, and clouds. That is like the thing that is now the focus. It's no longer, and for example, in the industry, often it's the hardware. It's not the software. You're selling the hardware, the software just comes with it. So there are also a lot of changes. One Ralph has already mentioned. It's we are not in a business that much any longer where like we have a chain, but it's an ecosystem. Why is it important that it's an ecosystem? In an ecosystem, it's important that you actually fit into this ecosystem. And when you're in the wrong ecosystem, you can be as good as you want. You will not succeed. So you have to choose and find the right ecosystem. One of the biggest problems with this ecosystem is that actually at the end, for a certain niche or for a certain area, only a few of them survive. So at the end, it's like the big fish eat the small fish. So the only way to go up against that, if you're like one of the small fishes, is try to build swarms. That's the reason why actually the community is the capacity. It's the important part that you understand. You have to get as many people or as many companies behind you as you can. And that is more or less, that's really important also for the area of IoT. It said that in 2020 we will have 4.5 million developers in IoT, meaning that actually there will be 4.5 million developers that you have to convince that your technology is the right one and that actually this technology is what they have to use for their stuff. So that, as said, an ecosystem is like the new way of doing the business. So when your technology is provided in an ecosystem that is not prospering, that is not promising for the future, you will never be able to convince all the developers, you will never be able to convince all the companies, meaning you will not have a good business. Especially with something that has a long life cycle, something like 15 years or 10 years, as for example hardware, when you're like positioning your hardware in the wrong ecosystem, you have a big threat. You're facing a big threat and you're endangering your business. So that's exactly where open source is coming into play. Open source is a strategic tool that you can use for actually facing these threats and also like making sure your business is prospering. It is not about like a hobby or anything like that. It's about business. And that's why all the IT companies are in that business, one way or the other. It's nearly, like at the moment, nearly every company in the world is using open source. The question is who is producing the open source and why are doing this? And that's the reason why they're actually doing open source, developing open source, releasing stuff as open source, and starting new projects. First of all, it's a really good way to create de facto standards. The other thing is looking at how actually to collaborate between companies. It's really hard when you're trying it with a joint venture. You have to sign contracts, you have to negotiate for a long time, and it's actually at the beginning before you even start developing. That means that actually you have to talk about how you share the cake in maybe 5 years when actually money is coming out of that. So doing a collaboration in an environment like a joint venture is really hard. With open source, you just say, hey, let's do a project together and start tomorrow. And the other reason when you're like when you want to buy something or when you need a technology for your stack, for your product, you have to do an investment not only in the software itself, but you have to do a big investment actually in everything that is coming on top of it. And changing that technology afterwards is really expensive. Okay, so yeah, like minimizing the dependencies is actually something that is one of the key reasons why the user communities are coming up. And it's also a really good way to do a marketing, actually making sure that your technology is known and it gets widely adopted. That means you're actually able to establish a new market with such a technology by building an ecosystem around it and making sure it's prospering. It's very easy for everyone to join, and they are not depending on these technology that much because they can influence it on one side, and they can also make sure that they can take the technology with them if, for example, if there are like conflicts coming up in that community. Another good reason is actually to break a proprietary monopoly that is there. When you're in the position that actually you are like you are on the technology that you need, or in the future there's a technology that you need, and you don't want to depend that much on this one company that is providing that, you can try to join up like with everyone else who is having the same problem and try to establish an alternative technology. The other thing is, compared to inner development, it's really good to have other people to share the cost, share the resources, share the risk, and also increase the quality by just looking on it and making sure that this actually is a good technology. So these are more or less the major reasons that I see why people are doing, or like companies are doing, open source as a strategic option for the business. So what does that actually mean for IoT? We're having at Bosch, we are having like a lot of use cases. For example, this is just one. We don't have the time to go through, like really like discuss them. So that's just like a track my tool, finding tools. The other one is trying to manage parking spaces, making sure that people don't have to drive that long for an available parking space. In general, like Bosch is producing 1 million things per day. And so you can imagine how important this stuff is for Bosch to make it actually these things usable in something like with smart devices. So, but that actually is like a general thing. It's yeah, you can start every time when you're having like a use case like that, you can start from the scratch, and that is what has been done in the past. But that's actually not a good idea to do that in the future. What you actually want to have, you want to have a platform that you can use so you can speed up your development. So that's actually where everyone is going. You want to have a cross-vendor, cross-domain platform that is usable for everyone. So that's actually the idea here. So all the devices can be served by one platform, and like all the solutions are on top of that. So everyone is going in here. Everyone wants to have this generic IoT platform because and wants to sell it, because that is actually a cool thing, because that would be a business, for a huge business, because you would earn a lot of money from everyone who is just participating in this ecosystem. So there are like different alternatives what can happen in this area. One is that there's one big vendor that just captures it all. As I said, there will be just a few ecosystems left at the end. So and if that would be like one closed IoT platform, actually what would happen is that this vendor, of course, as we all want to, would maximize its profits. And that is actually something that the people up here that are just participating in this ecosystem, and the people down here that are also just participating in this in this area, they would see that actually their profit is minimized, because of course this company wants to maximize their profit. The other problem that these people up here, up and down there, have, that actually they only have little control and influence as soon as this market has been really dominated by one vendor. So the alternative is actually that there's an open IoT platform, and so that means that actually everyone is participating in the cost, meaning that this cost will be minimized because it's just like shared cost, and that actually these up here and these up here can maximize the profits. And everyone that is actually taking part can do control and influence what is going on in there, and so they have a big opportunity to make sure that it's fitting their use cases and their specific needs. So that's the general idea, and that's like an open source or like an open strategy for like an IoT platform. So, but how to do it? And so for us, it's at the moment pretty obvious, or it's really promising, that IoT at Eclipse, the IT working group at Eclipse, is actually building something like that. And so we started to participate to a large extent. So these are like one of the some of the key projects there at the moment. So we are participating actually in a lot of them. So we are participating. We've started Hono, we started Warto, we started Hawkbit. Mosquito is really interesting for us, but we are just using it and looking at it at the moment. Paho as well, and Lishan in Californium, we are actually participating. So just to give you an idea how something like that could look like, you just see it here. So you see, actually, for the different use cases, we're trying to build things together. This is not the way it has been done, as far as I know, but this is like how it could look like in the future. So we are just using the different technologies that are there, and we just build the different solutions on top of this platform, built on top of IoT, the IT working group project at Eclipse. So Eclipse Kapua is another thing that is coming up. It's really also interesting because it's like building up an entire platform for like not only like individual projects. So it means that Eclipse IT is going to the next step, meaning that it's it's building an entire platform and not only individual projects. So, and that's like the current members that you see, which is a huge group, and it's really promising, and I hope like a lot of others will join. And like, but it's not only IoT, it's not only the Eclipse IT working group, but it's also, for example, that like on top of that, like the technology below that is also open source. And the one that we are currently focusing and that we are using is Cloud Foundry. And this is just like giving giving some some impressions, like how it looks like at Cloud Foundry, just some numbers. I think you've heard about everything at Eclipse so far, so just to give you a view. So these are also, again, all commercial companies that are trying to establish another platform, in this time a cloud platform, a generic cloud platform. And they're just all joining together and making sure that their business is prospering. So that's more or less what I wanted to say. Yeah, so I hope it helped and explained a little bit the situation that we are facing here. And yeah, so we'll give back now to Philippe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steffen, for your presentation. So, folks, if you have any question to us, please use the chat room attached to this webinar. You can just type your question, and we'll be happy to ask the presenter to answer to your question. I already have one point from Christian. From Yolocom.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. So Philippe, do you want me to answer to that?
Yes, you are very welcome to do it.
Yeah. So just to make sure that I understand the question correct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It could be an idea to have a decentralized IoT network. That is, of course, true. But typically what is happening actually in the cloud areas, that actually everything is getting more centralized. But yeah, the option is there. But from my point of view, the technology at the moment is going more and more centralized. But at least from like a technology view, but maybe not from. It doesn't have to be from a commercial viewpoint. It's the technology, but that's actually the open source idea. Share the technology and the instances. Let's see how it works out. But federations of IoT technologies is, of course, something that will happen, I guess, in the future.
Yeah, to add to Steffen's remarks, I think what is also needs to be made clear when we talk about a platform in our presentations, we don't necessarily have a technical platform in mind, but more a platform in terms of many components that are all under the same type of license, are all under the same type of governance. So the platform is actually not necessarily a complete system or an undistributed system. I think what Christian says could also be such a platform that just implements a distributed network, for example, like the internet.
And there's a second question from someone. Yeah. So they're like, he asked if he's missed someone and what is the typical business model for providing open source. So there are like there is a one-to-one replacement for a license model for open source software, and that is a subscription model. And actually, when you look in the .NET white paper from Microsoft in the year 2000, they said they want to move away from like selling licensed software and move to a subscription model. And you can do a subscription model with open source software as well. Because when you're actually looking at what actually all is needed besides just providing the software, like security updates, maintenance, customizing, support, training, all this stuff, then you can see actually that there is a real business model only around software. But from my point of view, the most important part is that everyone is even moving away from that and going to some other stuff that is actually the service models. So as I said, cloud, web services, selling hardware, and selling services in many other forms. That is where typically the revenue is coming from more and more. And the other stuff is, as I said, the subscription model.
Yeah, the thing, Harry, is that there is no typical business model anymore. There used to be a typical business model that was done by companies like MySQL and so on, which was a bait and switch model. So you use the open source and eventually you end up in a support contract or such, where you have special extensions that you have to buy as a commercial license. That was one thing that was done in the past very often, and it's Sugar CRM is one of them, MySQL is one of them, and so on. But there have been so many new business models, one, for example, described by Steffen just now, that are based on support, that are based on services around the platform, that are based on extension of the platform to be sold as commercial product, like in the Eclipse case. So right now there is a whole variety of business models already in place, and it would really go beyond the time that we have here to investigate them all. A typical business model doesn't exist anymore. There's really just a variety. And I ask everybody who wants to build a business on open source to really consider what licenses to use, because they typically dictate the set of business models that you are able to apply, as well as what the scope of the company is. So what we see more and more, and what we see more and more fail actually, is companies that just use open source and build products on top of it and sell them as software products. As we have seen in the slides before, the value of software, while more and more software is used, is actually getting diminished, more and more diminished. So you have to have a smart idea around this platform or around the offering that you have to be successful. Again, this is way too much to talk about today. So if you have any questions, just feel free to contact me or contact Steffen or contact Philippe, and we can further on the discussion.
Yeah, and there's one more question that I've seen here.
From Corinne.
Do we have time for another question?
Sure.
Okay, so there's the question, or like the first the hint that actually make the entire developed platform open source. Yes, that might be a long-term goal, but typically what you always see is that, for example, like a cloud provider or someone like that, they never have 100% open source. It's just logical. For example, you would never have like the company theme and also some company integration of some company services. You would never open source this stuff. So it's always the question about how much percentage, how much of the stack is actually open source. And typically what is happening is that the stack is increasing. And so you would always have something like a platform technology, and then you would actually see the integration in that in a commercial offering. And but yes, like making it, and the second part of the question is how to package that. As far as that's the way I got it, how to package it, so making like pieces available. And that's actually one of the key things, making sure that this kind of framework or whatever it is configurable in a way that everyone can actually customize their platform the way they want it for their commercial or in-house offering, because that's the alternative. You can set up your entire IoT platform for yourself and then trying to put it in a network of cloud of IoT platforms, and so that's like the alternative. Buying it from somewhere like as a service, or doing it yourself. And the customization and all that is an essential part of that. So from my point of view, that's what is making a good platform. So it's working for everyone with their use cases.
Do we have another question? There is one point I would like to ask you guys. It's about the governance. We are talking, when we are talking about open source, we are talking about governance also. So how do you see governance? How good or bad governance can help or versus kill your business?
Well, I think good governance means in principle that if you use an open source, or if you are a user or a contributor to an open source project or a platform or whatever you call it, good governance means that whatever the rules are, they need to be clearly defined. The rules of participation, the rules of contribution, and the rules of use. Rules of use are typically well defined by the license it's under, but also rules of contribution and so on have to be well defined. It needs to be clear who owns what, because open source doesn't mean that ownership gets lost. All the normal rules from the law of the country or the general law of the countries collaborating still applies. So even if you contribute something under open source, it needs to be still clear who, if you continue to be the owner of the intellectual property or not, or how this gets transferred. So all these things need to be well defined, and that's what I would call good governance.
Thanks.
Yeah, like from my point of view, it's I can just totally agree. What I said, that open source is a really fast and easy and efficient way of collaborating, it has the precondition that you actually have a method and that you have a way to do it. And it's hopefully you're not trying to set that up and reinvent that, like when you're starting a new open source project, because there are now millions of open source projects out there. It would be a really bad idea. So the best way is just take the best practices from former projects. And it's so nice that actually Eclipse has done that and written it also down. And so in this way, you have like rules that actually are binding from a legal perspective. And you also have like a compliance framework and all these things. You more or less have a working system, a working setup for starting an open source project. And that's one of the reasons why we became strategic members from Bosch, because we needed something like that. We needed a place for doing open source projects and doing them together with other companies with a well-defined rule set and a working setup.
Another concern that I face is about giving up IP and ownership. So can you say anything about that regarding the open source?
Sorry, I didn't understand. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, I was asking about some people have some concerns when they have to deal with open source is by giving up their IP and the ownership of their software.
Yeah, when you look at the situation today, in many situations, it's when IP or software, the word IP is in a way biased, and the software is really only differentiating in certain areas, and in others it's a burden because you have to maintain it, you have to make sure that it's still working, you have to make sure that it's fitting to the environment and everything. So you have to make sure that the software that you are keeping in your own company is actually doing you any good, and it's because otherwise it's just costing you a lot of money. So everything that is commodity is not valuable for a company to do that on their own alone. It's the other way around. It's a burden. So, but you always have to find out what is actually the burden and what is the crown jewels.
Yeah, Steffen, I think the question was more towards, hey, I take something that I own and I open source it. Now I've lost all rights on it. That's one of the myths of open source, and it's actually not true. Normal law applies, continues to apply, so, and then you have to look at an open source license the same way as any other contractual contract between two parties. When you license something under an open source license to the world or whoever, you actually continue to own whatever it is you are licensing. It's the same as Microsoft giving you a user license of WinWord. They continue to own it. If Bosch, for example, open sources some content under the EPL, they continue to be the owner of that software with all rights and all obligations that ownership brings with it.
Thanks a lot. So I don't see more questions on the chat room, so I think we can conclude this this webinar. I would like to thank both of presenters and also the audience for joining us. And if you have more questions later on, just ping us and through Kathleen or through myself, and we'll be happy to forward the questions to presenters and to give you an answer. So thanks a lot, guys. Have a nice day and a nice weekend. Bye-bye.